Hafade, buenas, mogathin, randinim, kaslia, yakwe, loha, mai kako, bula benakalavu, maluelele, talopalava, fafatai and other warm oceanic ingredients from across this sea of islands, but certainly Yarana Tato, Kaoha Nui, Tena Koto, Puroto Koto, Mauru no Te Pare Ra'ai Te Mahana, and some of the greetings from French Polynesia. Thanks so much, Tim, for this warm introduction, and thanks again all for, I don't know, spending a little bit of your precious Thursday afternoon time in this particularly heightened and intense moment with me and with this talk, which feels a little bit far afield from some of the unruly waters that we're all navigating in our private lives. And there was some discussion about Minneapolis during the lead up to this call. So thanks, thank you all for being here and wishing everyone and your communities of care, peace, and well-being in this moment. As Tim flagged, I'm Alexander Mawyer, or Alex. I'm here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and I've been here for a hot minute and have a sort of a plurality of interests. It's always a sort of fascinating to discover the challenge of identifying what kind of anthropologist one is when our field calls us to so many kinds of things. I've in chatting with Tim, I heard Tim flag for this group. I sort of wrote a very boffiny or a hyper. The original talk that I put together was a very classic kind of conferencey talk, and some the more active work that I've been engaged in the last year and a half or so at the end of an NSF project. I'll say something about at the end of this talk. But Tim got back to me and encouraged me to really develop the talk in a different direction. He noted that many of us in our this big what is it, Orbis Tertius blue-green marble world we live on, in this big anthropological space, many of us have not specialized in Oceania, much less in French Polynesia, as a site of continuing care and community engagement. One of my favorite Pacific anthropologists, and certainly well-known beyond Pacific anthropology across disciplines in Oceania, including the biosciences. But perhaps if you've crossed one Pacific anthropologist of place, it's probably a Peli Hauff. And he has a wonderful line at the end of a piece he did for Rob Borofsky in a fabulous book, Remembrances of Pacific Pasts. We cannot read our histories without knowing how to read our landscapes and seascapes. There are a lot of ways to take this line. I've been thinking about this line a lot over the last couple of years as a sort of marine social scientist or as an anthropologist who has found himself entangled in watery spaces again and again, coastal and near shore and deep seas. And we'll get to that in a moment. But one way to take this line, of course, is with Apelli is to remember that that anthropology has always been a discipline that was sort of at its best unafraid to re-examine its roots and its routes, as Clifford put it, and to examine where we're coming from. So just a flag in advance for this talk. There's sort of two parts. For those of you who aren't anthropologists of Oceania or who much less of French Polynesia, the first part of this talk, following one of Tim's requests, I'll try to story the sort of the history of anthropology in French Polynesia, and hopefully you'll know something more about this region. I will flag a few of my favorite volumes along the way in case you're like, what could I do in this winter season? How could I learn more about French Polynesia? I'll try to capture some of those best of works along the way. And then in the second half of the talk, we'll turn towards some of my work as a lens into the other kinds of anthropological work happening now, including by some colleagues who are also in this call, Pierre-Yves, Kate, and Claudia, and others whose names I spotted. So let's move forward. Obviously, going back to our warm Oceanian greetings, Oceania is a vast space. When seen from outer space, one might note that this ocean is the single most salient geographic fact of the planet on which we live, as Teresia Teaiwa, whose PhD was in the history of consciousness from Santa Cruz, flagged many years ago. This ocean space consists of over 20,000 islands. 13,000 of them are inhabited. Several thousand easily identified ethnic groups with the world's deepest and most intense history of both linguistic and cultural diversity, in some islands, PNG, Vanuatu, being regular sites for the examination of that kind of cultural complexity. My talk is not looking at Oceania as a whole today, although I'm happy to talk about this region. It's a pleasure working here at the center with thanks to Tim for a sort of shout out, I guess, to our University of Hawaii at Manoa Center for Pacific Island Studies and our sibling department, which are celebrating their 75th year this year. This is our 75th anniversary year here at the Center for Pacific Island Studies at UH Manoa, an interdisciplinary social science organized research unit with multiple anthropologists and geographers, political scientists, sociologists, and one marine biologist on our faculty. We're going to focus on French Polynesia. This is this part of Oceania. This circle constitutes a boundary around a non-self-governing, is identified by the United Nations list of non-self-governing nations, overseas country of France, a pays d'outre-mer, and under the most recent French constitutions. Just for purposes of scale, you could take all of Europe and drop all of Europe inside this circle, and Europe would go plump with a lot of space left over. That's how big French Polynesia is. Its EEZ, its exclusive economic zone, is greater than the territorial expanse of all of Europe, which is really a remarkable thing to wrap one's head around. The 5 archipelagos and hundreds of islands that constitute this this overseas French country, engaged over the last decades in ongoing political struggles and resonances back and forth between independents and autonomists, and sort of more aligned with the French state political movements, is inherently complicated. 5 archipelagos. Tahiti, the best known island in the region, probably, giants cast big shadows. But we have the Society Islands in the east. Just to the west of the Society Islands, the Tuamotu Archipelago, also called the Dangerous Archipelago. Once upon a time, it's famously where Thor Heyerdahl and his colleagues wrecked up on the ill-fated and I think ill-conceived Kon-Tiki expedition. If you were around in that moment of time or followed Heyerdahl's history, it's an interesting story to talk about. To the north of the Tuamotu are the Marquesas Islands. Obviously, like the Society Islands, extremely well known in part because of the literary, musical, and artistic legacies of various visitors over the years, to say nothing of local cultural heroes and products. And then the south of French Polynesia, you have the Austral Islands, Rimatera, Rutu, Tupuai, Raivai, and Rapa, and the Gambier Islands in the southwest, where I did my doctoral work. And I've circled the 3 parts of the region where I've conducted active field work, but I've traveled broadly across French Polynesia over the years. Another sort of just a curious thought of this talk, I realized in prepping for this or thinking about this, I started working in French Polynesia 29 years ago. So it's been a moment. I did highlight in yellow the 2 sites of French nuclear weapons testing, the French Center for Pacific Experimentation, a euphemism if I ever heard one, was centered on Fangataufa and Maururoa in the southern Tuamotu archipelago, Turea and Mangareva being the 2 most proximate communities, Mangarevans and Tureans, to those test sites. But the whole region is entangled in this story of French nuclear testing over the last decades, and we'll come to that in a little bit. For those of you who are wondering how to crack open the sort of foundations or histories of anthropology, I think anthropology and near field disciplines in French Polynesia, as promised, a very interesting place to start would be Bernard Smith's work, an art historian. He finished his dissertation in '56, I think. Bernard Smith's 2 magnificent works, European and the Vision in the South Pacific and Imagining the Pacific in the Wake of Cook's Voyages. Smith argues that basically that there's been incredible conceptual, intellectual, moral, visual, scholarly path dependency since the age of European navigators, that the early naturalists, ship surgeons, navigators aboard European vessels, jump ships, beachcombers, that the early arrivals from outside the region in the 18th century developed a series of concepts or ideas about this region that continue to reverberate through time, as they are produced and reproduced through later scholarship, through later literary works, through poetry, through music, through Smith's mostly focused on visual arts, of course, but through every medium of intellectual reproduction. I would just say for me, I was early in my career convinced of the utter salience of Smith's argument and its relatively ready to hand tractability for contemporary work. Smith argues that there are a series of frameworks through which French Polynesia is, as well as the broader Oceania, incorporated in outsider conceptual understandings, or visions, as he calls them, or imaginings, or representational norms, or whatever your framework of analysis is. Scientism, classicism, Edenism, romanticism, dark romanticism, and the picturesque in some of Smith's earliest work are frames through which this region, Oceania broadly, but certainly French Polynesia specifically, is produced and reproduced as an object of scrutiny. For those of you who work in science and technology studies, or who bumped into and played with that space, so how scientific objects are constructed, like Lorraine Daston's work, University of Chicago Press in the early 2000s. So for the construction of scientific objects, like anthropologists' construction of French Polynesia scientific object, here are some frameworks that get produced and reproduced in really interesting ways in our technical work. But there's certainly, as Smith argues, a series inside these frameworks, a series of sort of cross-cutting themes that show up again and again, regardless of whether you're taking a scientized approach, with a comparative social anthropology, or a classicist approach, right? So salvage work, or comparing Polynesian chiefdoms to Peloponnesian states in the age of classical Greece or something. Edenism, which are explorations of moral theory, romanticism, or dark romanticism, questions about the nature of the human condition and its moral condition, or the picturesque, an emptied out region that is a site of utopian fantasy, which might remind some of you, if you've ever read Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, of sort of this settler imagination of Oceania as hollowed out and present for utopian projects. Anyway, these themes of morality, sexuality and sensuality, primitivism, escapism, exoticism, naturalism, the issues of paradise and purgatory through Christian missionization lenses, ecologicalism, and the challenge of island states as marginal or fragile or vulnerable ecologies. These dynamics are identifiable in the writings of early arrivals from the outside, of European voyagers early on, and they're traceable over time, of fascination. The paintings on the right are by William Hodges, one of the many artists who traveled with / naturalists who traveled with Cook. Hodges' work, Tahiti Revisited, here captures a number of those frameworks and themes. You could, if you want to, linger over a Hodges painting. A person could very, very easily puzzle through a wide variety of conversations on the kinds of conceptual frameworks or representational norms that I was just riffing off of a moment ago. But Tahiti Revisited is this Edenic or a fallen paradise about to happen? Is this the picturesque, hollowed out escape that drives centuries later tourism to Tahiti? One of the most desirable tourist destinations on Earth. Is this a site for exploration of the meaningfulness of water? Or how about material culture and the tapa cloths on the right, or other kinds of issues, and so on. Tahiti Revisited, William Hodges. Okay, so just carrying forward, jumping into this. I wasn't quite sure how best to do this, so I sort of was like, in thinking about what Tim asked me to do. This is the first time I've done a doctoral comps in 30 years. So I went back to my doctoral comps experience. I was like, who are they? If I had to, like, off the top of my head, just name some of the folks that a person could track. Wallace, Cook, and Bougainville, 1767. Wallace's arrival, 1768. Bougainville's arrival, 1769. Cook's first arrival. Three of the early navigators. Of course, they are singular men with many other persons on their vessels, many of whom left ethnographic, sometimes ethnological traces that can all be unpacked, and that have been unpacked countless times by historians, but certainly that continue to bear ongoing scrutiny for anthropological work. Certainly, William Bligh or the Foresters, great examples of other characters who've received a lot of attention over the years. Bligh's famous, of course, a lieutenant for Cook, but later returns as captain of the Bounty, and then again after Bounty is taken from him a second time. Bligh's been the subject of some beautiful books by, among others, Greg Denning, and that really unpacks significant anthropological issues in the encounters across the beach and the meaningfulness of cultural regimes and cultural structures over time. Hard to beat Bly for pure fascination. If you're a film lover, of course, perhaps you've seen one of the many versions of the Mutiny on the Bounty film, all of which have local histories, and the last several in particular. So the sort of if any of you are anthropology and media folks, there's some really juicy and incredible work to be done and work that has been done, but only briefly, at that boundary between the production of public imaginaries and local communities seeking to resurface their own ethnographic and historical pasts. Missionaries like the Ellis, Knott, Oarsman, and so on at the bottom left enormous manuscripts of incredible historical and ethnographic interests. And again, the work of unpacking those 19th century volumes is happening right now. There's been attention over the years. They are still lively sites of encounter for local scholars. I put Melville and Gauguin on there. You know, both produced complicated works that have received entire seas of ink. You'd have to pulp a lot of squids to generate enough ink to to replicate the Melville or Gauguin literatures. But they are still somehow active sites of scholarship. Not so much by local scholars, but they're hard to miss, for sure. Mawyer Huth was a very fascinating character who left a lot of political papers. He was a U.S. consul in Tahiti and also a French consul at the time of the French seizure of the islands during the Second Empire period. Mawyer Huth and other diplomats also left ethnographic and historical records that are fascinating. And the last name in the bottom right, D'Urville, one of the sort of towards the tail end of the age of European global navigations. D'Urville is one of the constructors of the three culture regions that are typically assigned to Oceania: Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. And D'Urville's works are notable not only for setting up a sort of comparative structure for ethnographic or anthropological work across the region, but also while from the age of Wallace and Cook and Bougainville to D'Urville, while there had been quite a bit of languaging work, D'Urville really begins to formalize a linguistic or language-centered project in the region, making him a very, very interesting early arrival. Probably my favorite early arrival in French Polynesia is Darwin. Perhaps you've bumped into Darwin's his famous first publication of the structure and distribution of coral reefs. Mangareva, by the way, the Gambier Islands, the bottom middle, where I did my doctoral work. But this wasn't actually Darwin's first publication. Darwin's actual first publication was in 1836 with Fitzroy, the captain of the Beagle, a letter containing remarks on the moral state of Tahiti, which is an astonishing document, among other reasons. If curmudgeonly, grumpy old Darwin, with all of his inconsistencies and problematics and privileged member of the through marriage, the Wedgwood family, and so on, if Darwin rubs you funny, at least in this letter, you can see an extremely progressive Darwin who is very early on engaged in a debate that was raging from the age of Bly, at least, whose famous line is often reproduced. I always use the movie version because it's better than what's in his logbook. But it's a matter of supernatural indifference to me whether you contaminate the natives or they contaminate you. Bly uttered some version of apparently in the real world, but the movies spice it up. That debate runs from the 18th century and into the 19th century and into the 20th. And here's Darwin framing up that conversation and making a really beautiful argument for epistemic and ontological difference. Makes an argument that morality is not universal, and that local tata mohi or tata titi, that people of place are fully morally competent. Two works that I wanted to flame. If beyond Bernard Smith, if you're interested in pursuing a little bit more deeply either the early moment of encounter and navigational encounters across the beach, or a literary work that actually is extremely anthropological, I'm glad to suggest Jenny Newell, who's in Australia now. She was in the US for a hot minute, but is now the Australian National University, National Museum last time I checked. I think she's still there. Her book, Trading Nature, Tahitians, Europeans, and Ecological Exchange, is one of the most astonishing volumes about French Polynesia, specifically the Society Islands, that you could encounter. It is an extraordinary account of encounter. Sorry, not to misuse or double down on that word, but Newell traces the movement of goods, thoughts, ideas across the beach in both directions, focusing initially on botanical, on floral and faunal exchange. But she shows that so much more is moving across the beach in both directions. Victor Selgelin was a novelist, a surgeon, a doctor, and a Nietzsche fanatic. And his book, Les Immemoriaux, he was there in the after the in the 1880s, 1890s era. He was there in this sort of Belle Epoque moment after the French etablissement or the establishment of the French protectorate and French seizure of these islands had been already in place for a while, and he was extremely sensitive to French imperial hegemony and power. I don't think we won't find an anti-colonial languaging in the volume, but this book is fascinating. Many Tata Ma'ohi, many local scholars at the University of Polynesia Française, in their literature department, their students, they're returning to this book as a site of real engagement with the past. So here's a novel. This happens for Noa and even for Taipei sometimes, but that's all ephemeral. Here's a novel where local thinkers are returning to, even though written by an outsider, to think through Ma'ohi pasts. Tata Ma'ohi, people of place, sort of the contemporary ethnonym for French Polynesia across the region, from a Tahitian point of view. But for those five archipelagos, for Ta'ata Inata or Inana in the Marquesas, or Tangata Mangareva in Mangareva, Tata Ma'ohi sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work as an ethnonym, but just in case that comes out again, it is the locally recognized ethnonym now for people of this region. History of archaeology in the region, easy to go through. Let me just check my time. How am I doing? I'm gonna have to speed up. It kind of starts early with Catherine Rutledge, who was a monster. Just dug up a number of Marai in the Tuamotu, particularly in Temoe, after her time in Easter Island. But there's a fascinating history here. Just if you're looking for some names, obviously Kenneth Emery and Yoshi Sonoto, Eric Kant, Pat Kirch, these giants, done an enormous amount of work. The Otino Geringer, Barry Roulette, Suggs's early work in both ethnographic and did some archaeological work in the Marquesas. But if you're looking for a couple books to really look into, Jennifer Kahn's work over the last decades, and Guillaume Moll's over the last decades is astonishing. This is a very exciting moment and an exciting place for archaeology in Oceania, particularly that intersection or nexus between land management and use of natural resources, human nature entanglements and engagements. So Moll and Kahn have been doing incredible work in the last years with their students. Actually, there are a lot of archaeologists, but here are some of the names. It's not a space that I work in as much, but this is some of the folks that I follow. I'll just go quickly again to classic 20th century ethnography. For those of you who are sort of fascinated with that history of anthropology, it might be some familiar names, but on the top right, there's sort of one of the folks I'd most definitely flag, Te Rangi Hiroa, Peter Buck, Yale, Bishop Museum, rooted in a Maori, in several Maori iwi. His EV. Peter Buck's work on Mangareva, in particular the ethnology of Mangareva, but elsewhere in French Polynesia through his time, sort of a extremely classic work. Hard to summarize. The history of anthropology in French Polynesia looks a bit like the history of anthropology in many places across our conceptual training. Bengt Danielson's also interesting to flag, unless you're really looking for those early 20th century folks or mid 20th century folks. Bengt was obviously a Scandinavian, colleague of Thor's, and stayed in French Polynesia and became extremely engaged in training local students and in the anti-nuclear and anti-colonial movements and vibes. Benkt's many books, along with his spouse and intellectual partner, Marie-Helen, absolutely worth looking into if you're looking. So I love, I work in Mangareva, so Buck is kind of my go-to person, but his ethnology of Mangareva, is a jewel. It is a gem of that classic late 20s, early 30s era anthropological moment in Oceania. Handy and others are Emery and so on, Simpson, all in the same style of work, sort of documentary, salvage engaged. Buck's archives, which I think I've read everything in the Bishop Museum has in Buck's boxes, complicated. He was certainly conscious of and left a lot of language around the idea that he was seeing a world disappear, that he was, as the old salvage lines of thought go, that he was documenting a moment maybe that had already passed in the Gambia, which I don't agree with at all. But it's powerfully interesting work. There is a great moment. If you want to know one thing about French Polynesian anthropology, card-carrying anthropologists, PhDs in anthropology, it's Harvard's Society Islands project that Doug Oliver stepped up in the 50s and roped a flock of other people into. Oliver famously invited Bob Levy, cousin of Roy Rappaport. He's Skip's Rappaport's cousin, which is fascinating. It was a trained psychiatrist in working in that space. Douglas and Oliver and Levy bring 4 students: Ben Finney, Richard Munch, Anthony Hooper, Paul Kay, all of whom go on to have enormously interesting careers. Hooper mostly in Tokelau, outside of French Polynesia. Paul Kay, of course, and Brent Berlin become completely, utterly, transformatively famous in a different scholarly area. But Paul cut his teeth in French Polynesia as part of the Harvard Society Islands project. Ben Finney stayed working in French Polynesia, came here to the University of Hawaii, and in the 70s, very, very well known and possibly a name that you might have crossed paths with others, helped step up the Polynesian Voyaging Society and was one of the seed persons for the construction of the voyaging canoe, Hokulea, who's just started a new multi-year journey. There is no way for Pacific scholars, however we're positioned, to overlook the significance of the Polynesian Voyaging Society and the Hawaiian voyaging canoe, Hokulea. Ben was one of the seed persons for that. Weirdly, Greg Denning, not part of the Harvard Society Islands project, but was one of Doug's students at the exact same time, doing his PhD in the late 50s and 60s when he finishes, middle of the 60s. Greg Denning's also part of this Harvard moment. These works come out. There's plenty you could dive into. If you were going to ask me, if any of you who've never worked in or thought much about French Polynesia, what's the one book about Tahiti to read? I would say it's Tahitians' Mind and Experience in the Society Islands. If you're looking for like the classic compilation of classical anthropology, post mid-century, right? So in the front end of whatever anthropology is going to become, it's Oliver's Ancient Tahitian Society, and then its contemporary counterpoint, Two Tahitian Villages. Two Tahitian Villages, interestingly, is being restudied right now by Maori scholars in this moment. I can't story their story, but just to give a sense of how lively this is. But Levy's Tahitians, very interesting to read against his work in Nepal, if you're a Levy fan or follow Bob's work but anyway, Mind Experience Society Islands, extraordinarily insightful and extremely resonant, and once again, a text that scholars at UPF or local scholars find very, very sort of like the Segolin, surprisingly, one can hear surprisingly like this really feels like us, which is not what anthropologists always get from community members, right? So another book from this period, of course, I mentioned him. If you're going to read a second book in French Polynesia, Greg Denning's Islands and Beaches, Discourses on the Silent Land, the Marquesas, 1774 to 1880. Obviously, Denning is famous as an anthropological historian, not a card-carrying anthropologist exactly, but he was, what to say? This is what anthropology can be at its best through a historical lens. Wonderful book, will leave you chilled in some ways. Denning, among other things, in Islands and Beaches, offers one of the most profound windows into the most horrific dimension of anthropological work in French Polynesia, which is the depopulation of these islands after contact with Europeans or after European arrivals. In some communities, the loss of community approximated 90% of community members. So particularly in the Gambia, where I worked for my doctoral research and still maintain projects, and in the Marquesas, imagine living in a social world where 9 of 10 people pass in 30 years. You can't imagine it. And Kate Riley's here, who works in the Marquesas. There may be other folks who have profound work in this community, but the relevance of this work to contemporary work is still unmistakable. Which takes us 20th century to the present. We're going to do okay. We started a few minutes late. I think we end in 20 minutes. I promise to end on time. I know time is present and fleeting. I've not captured every anthropologist working in the last 20 or 25 years, but I tried to flag some of the folks who came to mind most quickly for me. Deborah Ellison on sexuality and gender. Fred Tarrant, who's a French scholar, his you'd have to read French, but his work in the Tuamotu is incredibly classic and yet incredibly contemporary. His linguistic competence is astonishing. Emily Donaldson in the Marquesas. You might have been seeing her work recently in classic AA journals, American Ethnologist or Cultural Anthropology. Donaldson's book, Working with the Ancestors, about Marquesian relationships to the past, is field leading. Nick Thomas in the Marquesas and elsewhere, mostly through colonial material cultural analysis. Mimi Khan again on colonial and post-colonial structures, some beautiful work around the post-nuclear period. Mai Misaki, contemporary anthropologist, brand new, Oxford, doing incredible work at the intersection of traditional Taitian medicines, missionization, and contemporary Christianities work. Tulilan Barre, Alvec. There are any number of French scholars who we could flag. Barre is very, very important if you're interested in really understanding the sort of historical anthropology of French Polynesia through a French scholarly lens. Anne Salmond, back to the encounter period. Of course, her Aphrodite's Island work is astonishing. If you read Italian, Matteo Aria's work on memory, it's extremely contemporary. And Matteo's student Giacomo Nerucci and some of Matteo's other students who I've missed flagging here, picking up on the past and the present. Kate Riley, Christian Gassarian, other scholars. Kate's on the call. Kate's a linguistic anthropologist with many interests, including food and culture and power and culture, power and language. Christian in the Austral Islands. Liz Kaiser in the Tuamotu on nuclear legacies and nuclear histories. Claudia Larucci on militarism and new militarisms in French Polynesia, sort of base worlds. Two of my students I threw in there because I know how good their work is and is going to be, but Oliver Lulford, who's working on the discourses around coral reef restoration. Mawyer, Alessandra Shea Ali, whose work is in Malpiti, and Mawyer on again Mohi traditional medicines and relationships with between human relationships with marine species, particularly non-charismatic marine species, so land-sea relationships. There's one name flagged here. It's Bruno Sarra. Whoops, going the wrong way. There has been a remarkably productive scholar of French Polynesia in place, grew up in Tahiti. Bruno Sarra, enormous number of books. I got a whole bookshelf over there of Bruno's work. They're all remarkable. One of them is in English, so if you don't happen to have the pleasure of reading in French, Bruno's work of Fish Named Tahiti. Bruno's a social anthropologist and carries a lot of symbolic or French structural anthropology into his work. He's worked on colonial histories, political figures in the era of cultural renewal and revitalization, political autonomy issues, new Christianities in Tahiti, French-Tahitian relationships. He's got a brand new book out that's not on the screen on Tahitian myths. He's an incredible scholar and wildly productive if you're looking for who's been sort of one of the center figures of the last years. It's certainly Bruno. And of course, there's a radically growing number of Ta'ata Mauhi scholars from the region. The most established is Tamatoa Bambridge, who has been for many conversations become an enormously influential figure for global scale marine governance and indigenous marine leadership over the future of Earth's seas and marine resources. His work is incredibly influential, and he's a friend and a co-author of mine. Just by, I guess, the NPR sort of just a caveat, he's a friend and co-author and a sort of older brother figure to me. But this Edgar Tetiutupa, linguistic anthropologist in the Marquesas, Tamatoa and Edgar, their PhDs are in anthropology, but there are many other scholars whose PhDs are in linguistics or who have master's degrees in literature or PhDs in literature or other fields who are producing very ethnographically rich works. And at the bottom of the screen, it's just dot, dot, dot. There's so many students who are in programs right now. Melanie Ganeve, Takuro Perront, Albert U, Marguerite Tayarui, and so many others who are being trained by some of the people on this screen or in the prior screen. This is an extraordinary moment. Here's, if you're looking for Tamatoa's two volumes, if you're interested in that, what's happening in the nature space there, his edited volume, the Rahui, I have a chapter in there, and Oceans and Commons, or Commons and Oceans, Rahui and Polynesia, to his very big works that are really influencing a lot of scholars in conservation, sustainability, and marine governance, or just governance and cross-cultural legal conversations. Tamatoa's doctoral work, however, was in land tenure in the Austral Islands, particularly Rapa. Fascinating, just absolutely fascinating scholar. A hoot. Folks, I think I've honored Tim's request that I produce a summary of the history of French Polynesian anthropology, but just in this last 15 minutes, I'm glad to flag a little of the kind of work that I've been doing as an example of a kind of long-running anthropologist in the region. And we'll end quickly with, I guess, a little summary point. Probably the biggest unruly waters in the region are the history of French nuclear testing, which begins in the mid-60s, before the Battle of Algeria, but after France has concluded that it's going to lose North Africa. France moves its nuclear test regime to Muluro and Fangataufa in French Polynesia. The structural implications for social and cultural life and linguistic practice in the region would take a whole series of classes to unpack, or seminars or lectures or whatever. But the entanglement of France and place is impossible to miss. Here's Bastille Day in Riquité in the Gambier 20 years back, with the Breton priest, the Madame Richton, the mayor, the gendarme, the second mayor, the third member, and some of the Mutoy, or local police in the background, other leading figures. There were 210 nuclear tests conducted in French Polynesia, and an enormous number of retombées, or fallout events, in particular places. The entire region is touched, and this is one of the most complicating facets of anthropology here. My work in the Gambier, along with Real and Turea, the three most locally impacted communities. Although you can see Tahiti has had very, very good. Tahiti had more meteorological equipment than many of these other islands, so we don't actually know the full extent of fallout across the region. Is the point I would make, but it's an extraordinary, complicated part. In 2005, the French journal Damocles leaked French state secrets that they knew that there had been fallout in the region. So that this is only discussable in the last 2 decades in a kind of public way. So that maladie du secret, or the sickness of secrecy, that the region experienced over decades of French nuclear testing, has been erupted, and many of the students who are working in French Polynesia for their doctorates or MAs right now are engaged with these nuclear legacies, as are communities themselves. There were a series of reports conducted in 2006, and this one in particular, the KESCN, the Commission d'enquête sur les conséquences des essais nucléaires, published in 2005 at the end of that year. They're still reverberating through today. There's quite a decent literature that's available now on nuclear test histories. The Mary Helen Didier, another artist and a friend, her book, Witnesses of the Bomb, a Testimony of the Bomb, is a remarkable series of firsthand accounts. Turning to some of my own work beyond this sort of nuclear experience, which is hard to talk about. Here's Mawyer, where I did my doctoral research, a sort of classic small community at the time that was still in the sense of engage in every one of the dynamics we could identify for French Polynesia: cultural renewal, cultural survival, persistence, nuclear legacies, political autonomy, relationships between outer islands and inner islands, new Christianities, and on and on. So my own work has been, so I'm a cultural linguistic anthropologist at this intersection nexus of language and space, language and nature, language and wellness, the political language and poetics. So just going back to going back to this, this is a page from in the 19th century. Mawyer was the first site of Catholic missionization in Oceania. At the time of European arrivals in 1814, the population was somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 persons. By 1874, there were fewer than 500 people living in the island. And in the meantime, they had built one cathedral that seats 2,000, four other giant stone churches that seat 500 each on the 14 islands in the archipelago, seminary, the first college in the Pacific, an abbey, a king's palace, triumphal arcs, all sorts of things. And here's a poetry chapbook produced from one of the students of that college. But you can see that bugs have chewed through the poetry. So obviously a bit of a visual metaphor for the challenge of culture and language maintenance over time in this place. So I've been interested in plant species and human floral relationships over time. I had the pleasure of falling into a dictionary working group as a doctoral student and pulled into this work. What is the nature of the forest? Or how do we understand in French Polynesia upland spaces? What do they mean? Is forest a natural category or a natural kind, or are local ideas about nature, like the word vow, which is not mean forest, but would seem to apply, would be the word to translate forest with, are vow spaces different kinds of spaces, and how to understand such things? How do we understand the linguistic legacy of that period of loss? So I did a large project on working through the language of illness before the COVID-19 pandemic. Weirdly, so I'm sort of really interested in how particular cultural domains are encoded in language, and how we can reconstruct, if we can, aspects of the past. In particular, how do 19th century dictionaries from Mangareva reflect those periods of intense disease in the century of encounter? What about water? How to think about water in this place? So I had a project on water and springs, some of which have moved over time. Water names as place names are incredibly salient across Polynesia. And what happens when your place names no longer map onto the lived reality of place, as in when the waters have moved to somewhere else? And with Rick Feinberg and others, Rick who's in the call, I've been very interested in language and space over years, and sort of the linguistic encoding of spatial cognition, which is a really super fun topic. So those are some of the areas that I've worked in broadly. So had a recent piece with Leah Pappas in Oceanic Linguistics, the place of space in oceanic linguistics. I worked with Rick in an ethos volume years ago. I did a paper on mana some time back. What is the state of mana in contemporary cultural discourse? Does mana mean what it used to mean? Matt Tomlinson and Ty Tangon did a wonderful edited volume. This is a chapter on new mana, this classic Polynesian concept, and how the concept itself is changing in community over time or not. A paper in ethnographic approaches to rivers in Oceania on those sort of unflowing pasts, lost springs and watery mysteries in Eastern Polynesia, place names and water work. More recently, I've been interested in governance issues. With Pierre-Yves Lemur, we had a piece in Oceania on France and Oceanian sovereignties. Relatively recent paper in Pacific Affairs on some of the techno overlords in San Francisco wanted to build floating islands as microstates in French Polynesia's lagoons. So I had a paper trying to explore what that might mean for French Polynesia. Speaking of unruly waters, what happens when impossibly wealthy billionaires seek to expropriate lagoon space as sovereign microstates in an overseas French country? So it's sort of interesting question. And then that sovereignty work or governance work for me is continued to be an edge, I think, for many others here and elsewhere in Oceania, at the nexus of local politics, regional politics, and global politics, and conservation and sustainability in this age of the Anthropocene. So Jerry Jacka at Colorado and I had a piece in environmental conservation some years back in 2018 on this, and with Tamatoa and Paul Darcia, an historian of Oceania whose book People in the Sea is another wonderful volume, just not French Polynesia focused, did a piece on Oceanian sovereignty. Perhaps the most extraordinary, from my point of view, one of the most extraordinary things happening in French Polynesia right now is the resurgence of indigenous or traditional resource management practices called Rahui in across many Reo Maui or languages of place. Tamatoa Bambridge has been the center point. I've referenced his work above for this work. Our student, we co-directed a student of yours at Pauline Faub, and with some colleagues, Joaquin Claude and Eleanor Sterling. And this is if you're interested in that space. But the reemergence of Rahui across French Polynesia would be almost, again, could have been its own separate talk. I'll just move forward to that. Rahui space. The first one to reemerge was here in the, you might have seen the Olympics, the famous surf spot, Te Aupo'o. It's a space that is locally managed and locally governed. It could be land or sea. Right now, the Rahui resurgence has been largely marine, where local fishing rights are being organized by local committees and governed in different ways. The Rahui resurgence, which began here in Tairapu Coast on Tahiti Island, in this community of Taupo'o, has spread. There are now Rahui, almost 20 of them around the island of Tahiti, and Rahui on many other islands across French Polynesia. There are always pre-stories, so there were a few Rahui that had survived from the 19th century to the present in the Austral Islands and the Tuamotu. But this action of setting aside resources is leading to a lot of incredible ethnographic work, including around place names, documenting legends, documenting stories, documenting relationships to nature, documenting land sea relationships, documenting species relationships, local ecological knowledge, and so on, documenting material culture. Like here's a Punaia classic Tahitian traditional practice, the carving of fish stones, which would be used by appropriate authorized users in the as late as we know this was still happening in the early 20th century, because Charles Nordhoff, whose Men in the Sea trilogy led to the efflorescence of Mutiny and the Bounty movies, Nordhoff wrote a beautiful piece for the Journal of the Polynesian Society on Tahitian fishing practices. And we know that Punaia were still being used, but you turn the stone one way and it pulls the fish in, you turn the stone the other way and it pushes the fish out. And there's this exquisite and elaborate series of practices that go around this very simple mechanical description that I've just given. Punaia are some of the few religious or religious is not the right word, sacred sites that weren't thrown down during the iconoclasm in Tahiti, and they are still around the coast line across the Society Islands. There are comparable fish stones across French Polynesia. Very, very interesting. So this Rahui practice is making visible and thinkable again many other kinds of anthropological dimensions. Just, I think I promised to mention a couple more recent projects. I just finished an NSF with Belmont. It was part of the Belmont Forum project on cone snails and human mollusk relations. I'll be in Paris in a few weeks giving a talk at the National Museum of Natural History on human mollusk relations. But anthropologists like myself are being pulled into conversations about sustainable engagement with wild species and other kinds of ecological environmental concerns. That's Kate's friend and my friend Edgar Tetiotupa in the lower left, a linguistic anthropologist, giving documentary at a convening for traditional practitioners of medicine, in which cone snails have some place. These cone snails generate a suite of conopeptides or conovenoms. They're extremely venomous and bioactive. Not all fatal. Some are really dangerous with various implications. So last slide. I think I promised to finish on time. It's 10:59. Coming out of that cone snails work with geneticists and ecologists, I've become really interested in and somewhat concerned by the amount of big data that's being generated by our bioscientists that actually have real implications for local communities and indigenous ecological knowledge, quite beyond CITES or quite beyond Nagoya or quite beyond protecting the bioprospecting concerns. It's in my little abstract. I didn't save enough time to really get into that, but I'm happy to follow up if anybody's doing that kind of work. I think that's an extraordinarily important space for anthropologists going forward, because the vast majority of research in French Polynesia today is absolutely in the biosciences, not in the social sciences, notwithstanding that efflorescence of local scholarship that I described. Resurfacing issues, occurrence in Polynésie Française or French Polynesia anthropology. Hopefully, you've just been reading the screen from salvage accumulation, kind of work that Buck or Suggs or Handy were doing, to epistemic repatriation, local communities. Guillaume Avec is sort of, or Emily Donaldson documenting, Kate is on the call, documenting the significance, reemergence of Indigenous and local knowledges of various kinds of natural domains, for instance. The culture history dialectic, in Oliver or Denning, some of their students. Levy's Interruption, that Tahitian's book, couldn't recommend more seriously. The historical, ecological, and environmental entanglements from the 70s, sort of early to the present. Contact ethnography and cosmological incommensurabilities, again, that's just ongoing from that very first slide with Bernard Smith, who's an art historian, to the present. I think we're still in that conversation, very lively. Indigenous political resurgence. I hope I flagged that in some space. I don't know if I did anything like the even minimum justice to the way in which the legacies of French nuclear testing are a context for real political activation in an overseas French country, whatever overseas, pays d'outre-mer de la France, whatever that means in the current French constitution. People will be working on this, and our students are working on this. And Claudia Letarucci is on this call, and Pierre-Yves Lemur on this call, and a few others. Lots of incredible work happening now. Cultural exchange and colonial entanglements. Nick Thomas, Ground Zero. I hit the post-nuclear legacies, and of course, place stewardship, imminence, epistemic and ontological modesty. I guess I was sort of pointing at some of my work, if you're interested. Just as actually, there was that one last side. Alan Howard and I did do in the History of Anthropology review. Alan Howard, like Rick Feinberg, if you're sort of interested in Polynesia, it turns out Rick or Alan has written something about it, whatever your topic is. It doesn't matter what the topic is. It turns out Rick or Alan has a comment somewhere on that issue. And Rick, I can see Rick smiling. It's true, though. Alan and I did an analysis of the history of the Association for Social Anthropology of Oceania's papers, sessions, from the founding of that association to 10 years ago. And we published that. If you're interested in the kinds of thematic currents that I'm talking about here, hence the Unruly Waters line, we did publish something on the history of anthropology for the region a few years back. Our argument in that piece is that the topics of fascination for Pacific anthropologists are profoundly recurrent, back to that path dependency line I started with, that we circle back around to classic issues in this region again and again. And my suspicion is that this is true for every region in anthropology, that we have our hobby horses, even as new topics emerge, like post-nuclear legacies or militarisms. Voir titi vive, old postcard. Thanks so much. Mahalo mauru, merci. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexander. That was, oh my gosh, that was a master class of going through what French Polynesia is going to be, is contemporary, is happening at the present time. Thank you so much. And you're right in the middle of it, obviously. So that's really, really exciting. And I'm sure that there are